Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Madison was always the kind of woman who drew attention wherever she went. Beautiful, elegant, vain, and with a smile that seemed to have been trained to charm anyone. She led a life that many women dreamed of. Luxury cars, international trips, designer clothes, and an unlimited credit card that never needed a balance check. In the eyes of others, she was a fulfilled, happily married woman. But behind this perfect facade hid a dissatisfaction that grew like a silent shadow, day after day. Her marriage to Christopher, heir to one of the wealthiest families in Dallas, seemed perfect to those looking from the outside. But for her, it no longer made sense. Conversations had become monotonous, dinners were silent. The trips that once seemed magical now felt like just another obligation, a social theater. She felt suffocated, bored, trapped in a routine where love had turned into convenience and passion had been replaced by formalities. It was exactly in this scenario that Brandon appeared. A man different from everything she was used to. Charismatic, confident, with that kind of look that seems to pierce through any armor. They first met at a cafe when she accidentally dropped her purse on the floor and he, with all that almost rehearsed kindness, bent down to help her. His smile, the way he spoke, the way he made her feel alive again, it all affected her more than she was willing to admit at the time. The meeting started with casual conversations. A glance here, a provocative comment there. And before she realized it, what seemed like a harmless distraction quickly turned into something more intense. Within a few weeks, they were already meeting frequently in hotels during lunch hours. It was as if she had found there what she had been missing: attention, desire, adrenaline, and most importantly, that feeling of being truly desired. Lying in his arms, feeling Brandon's fingers running through her hair, she caught herself laughing, something she hadn't done so naturally in a long time. It was precisely during one of these encounters, on an ordinary afternoon, that she let slip something that even to her seemed surreal. "You know, today is our wedding anniversary," she said, looking at him with a half-sarcastic, half-suspicious smile. Brandon raised an eyebrow, squeezed her waist lightly, and responded in the same teasing tone, "And you're here? I thought you'd be celebrating with your husband." Madison took a deep breath and let out a dry laugh. "He's unbearable. A bore, you have no idea." Brandon paused, looked her in the eyes, as if trying to understand how far this went, and asked, this time more seriously, "If that's the case, why don't you just end it?" The question hung heavy in the air. She turned her face, looked at the ceiling, bit her lips, and after a few seconds of silence, answered something that seemed to have been stuck inside her for a long time. "Because it's not that simple," she said, crossing her arms over his chest, as if searching for a less painful way to explain. "Before we got married, my father-in-law insisted on including a clause in the contract. And guess what? I, foolishly, signed without thinking, believing it was just a formality, that it would never make a difference." She shook her head, squinting her eyes, blaming herself to this day for that decision. "If I file for divorce or if he catches me cheating, I walk away with nothing. Absolutely nothing. No house, no money, no car, not a single dollar. Yes, I was stupid. I regret it to this day." Brandon remained silent for a few moments, looking at her, as if processing that information. Then, with that somewhat sarcastic, somewhat ironic tone she already knew well, he replied, "In other words, you're trapped. You only leave if he decides to let you go first." She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and responded, this time without any irony, "Exactly. That's why, he has to give up first." That conversation wasn't just a confession. It was almost a declaration of war, a revelation that explained much of what she did, what she thought, and especially why she persisted so much in that dangerous game. Because deep down, Madison wasn't just living an affair. She was playing chess with her own life. And in that game, she believed she was a few steps ahead. The problem is that when you play with life, the pieces don't always move the way you imagine. When night fell, Madison put on the dress he loved so much. She looked at herself in the mirror, fixed her hair, touched up her makeup, and took a deep breath. She knew she needed to act well. After all, that dinner was nothing more than an obligation. She grabbed her purse and headed to the restaurant, maintaining the posture of a perfect wife, the one who always appeared smiling in photos, greeting everyone warmly, making sure to flaunt the life she led. Inside, impatience was eating her alive. That performance was becoming increasingly unbearable. When she arrived, she saw Christopher already seated at the table. He didn't even get up. He stared fixedly at the menu, as if she weren't even there. She walked up to him, smiled, and sat down, expecting at least some eye contact, but she didn't even receive that. She noticed he didn't bother to start a conversation. The silence seemed heavier than any words. As she tried to hide her discomfort, adjusting the silverware, crossing her legs, and forcing a smile, he just kept his gaze lost, as if she were a stranger. "So, did you choose this restaurant?" She tried to start a conversation, pretending lightness in her voice. Christopher just nodded. "Yes," he replied dryly, without looking into her eyes. She laughed, awkwardly, and bit her lower lip, feeling that heavy atmosphere taking over. She tried again, "It's been a while since we've been here, right?" Again, no reaction other than a cold, short nod. Inside, she was already starting to get irritated. She even thought about making a sharp comment but took a deep breath and held back. After all, that role of the devoted wife had to be maintained, even if only for a few more hours. The waiter brought the appetizer. Christopher didn't comment on the dish, nor did he make that classic gesture of offering it to her first, like he used to do. He was distant, cold, calculating every second, every movement. On the other hand, she fidgeted in her chair, trying to seem natural, but unable to understand where all this coldness was coming from. She even thought he might just be tired, stressed from work, or maybe suspicious of something. But deep inside, a discomfort arose that she couldn't quite pinpoint, she just felt it. While cutting her food with more force than necessary, she looked directly at him and decided to provoke. "Is everything okay? You seem a little strange today." The response was an uncomfortable silence, followed by a long sip of wine. Madison looked around, noticing that some couples at nearby tables were talking, laughing, toasting, exchanging affectionate glances. That scene only increased the tension she felt. It felt like psychological torture. Every second that passed seemed longer than the previous one. The main course arrived. She tried once again to break that suffocating ice. "I was thinking, maybe after dinner we could." Christopher dropped his silverware onto the plate and interrupted, cutting off any attempt she made to bring lightness to the evening. He crossed his arms, adjusted himself in the chair, and said, in a firm, dry tone, loaded with irony that made her heart race, "Did you enjoy your last meal at an expensive restaurant?" She froze. Her eyes widened, her whole body went cold, and she held her breath for a few seconds, trying to understand if she had heard correctly. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice faltering, trying to maintain composure but feeling her hands begin to sweat. Christopher calmly pulled an envelope from inside his jacket. That gesture seemed rehearsed. He placed the envelope on the table, slid it toward her, and slowly opened it, letting several photos fall out. Madison looked at those images and felt her stomach churn. They were pictures of her, with Brandon, at the hotel, in situations that required no explanation. The blood drained from her face. She felt a mix of shame, fear, desperation, and disbelief. She tried to catch her breath, but her mouth dried up every second. Her hands trembled. This. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Christopher then pulled out a small USB drive, placed it on top of the photos, and added with a chilling calmness, "There's video too. In case you want to watch yourself in action." She stared at it, unable to believe she was actually living this nightmare. She looked at him, trying to read some expression, some sign of pity, doubt, or perhaps that he was bluffing, exaggerating, testing, but no. His gaze was the most serious she had ever seen. There was no room for any doubt. It was the look of someone who knew everything. Who was determined. Who, for a long time, had stayed quiet, waiting for the right moment to drop the bomb. Christopher then pushed his chair back, stood up calmly, adjusted his jacket, looked her in the eyes, and said, without raising his voice, with a frightening calmness, "See you in court." He turned around and walked away, leaving Madison there, completely shattered, alone, surrounded by photos that now seemed to weigh tons, photos that tore apart not only the paper but her dignity, pride, and the false sense of security she thought she had. She couldn't even react. She sat frozen, staring at the open envelope, trying to understand at what point her life had turned into this nightmare. Everything she thought she controlled, was now slipping through her fingers like fine sand, impossible to hold on to. And in that moment, she understood, even though she didn't want to accept it, that the game she thought she was winning, maybe had never been hers. The process was so fast that Madison barely had time to process what was happening. Within days, she received the official notification. The prenuptial contract she always treated as mere bureaucracy was now a sentence. And there was no escape. Lawyers, hearings, papers, everything unfolded like an avalanche, crushing every piece of the life she had built over the past few years. The fortune she believed would guarantee her comfort for the rest of her life, simply vanished. It was as if someone had pulled the rug out from under her feet and left her face planting into the reality of the ground. When the judge confirmed the validity of the contract and the division of assets exactly as stipulated, she realized she had nothing left. Cars, properties, jewelry, credit cards, bank accounts, everything went back to Christopher's name. The only thing she could take were a few suitcases of clothes and personal belongings. And suddenly, that woman who paraded around with $20,000 bags, shopped in New York, and spent weekends in Paris, now had to figure out where to sleep that night. But deep down, Madison still had one card up her sleeve, or at least she believed she did. Brandon. The man who, in recent months, had made her feel alive, desired, loved. The one who, during all those conversations in the hotel, promised they would be happy together, that she didn't need that suffocating marriage anymore. And it was to him that she clung as her last hope. Because if everything collapsed, at least the love, or what she believed was love, was still there. As soon as she left the hearing, she grabbed her phone and called. Once, twice, 3 times. The call went straight to voicemail. She sent a message. No delivery. She checked his status. Offline. Strange, because Brandon was always quick to respond, almost instantly. She got nervous, tried again, and nothing. She thought maybe he was busy, had lost his phone, or was out of signal. In her mind, she made every effort to justify that silence. Desperation began to take over. She opened Instagram. Page not found. She searched Facebook. Gone. WhatsApp, just that cursed double check mark showing the message wasn't delivered. The photos they took together? None. Because Brandon always said it was safer that way, that he preferred to live in the moment, without records, to avoid any problems. After all, she was a married woman. At the time, it even sounded romantic. Now, it seemed like a trap. She spent 2 days trying, searching for clues, mentally replaying every detail, every word, every gesture. She began to question whether she really knew who Brandon was. She tried to remember if he ever talked about family, friends, work. And she realized, with a lump in her throat, that everything she knew were loose stories, superficial, without evidence, without connection to real life. It was as if he were a ghost who, for months, pretended to be flesh and blood. It was then, at the height of her despair, that she decided to seek out Emily, an old acquaintance, someone who always moved in the same social circles but with whom she never had a close relationship. Emily had always made it clear that she didn't like her, but even so, Madison swallowed her pride and decided to try. She called, arranged a coffee meeting, and went. Emily received her without much ceremony. She crossed her arms, looked directly into her eyes, and said, without beating around the bush, without filters, without any intention of easing the pain she already carried, "Did you really believe he came into your life by chance?" Madison, with an empty expression, responded with that lost look typical of someone who no longer knows where they stand. Emily then dropped the sentence that turned her world upside down, "Wake up, Madison. You were used. He didn't love you. He never loved you. Actually, you don't even know who he really is." That hit her like a punch in the chest. Her eyes widened, she adjusted herself in the chair, felt her hands go cold and her legs tremble. She asked, almost without a voice, "What are you talking about?" Emily then took a deep breath, looked at her, and added, "I shouldn't be telling you this, but since you're here, I'll spare you from continuing to be a fool. Brandon never existed. Well, the guy you met with that name doesn't exist. You fell into a trap, Madison. And do you know who set it up? Your ex-husband." For a few seconds, she thought it was a joke, part of some cruel prank. But Emily's gaze was serious. And deep down, she knew it wasn't a lie. What started as a chill ran up her spine, tightened her chest, and made her stomach churn. Madison tried to remember everything. Every detail. And the more she thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together, in a way she had never imagined. The silence that formed in that cafe was like a black hole, sucking everything around it. She stared at Emily, trying to find some explanation that would make sense of it all, but found none. Her hands trembled. Her mouth dried up. And it was at that exact moment that it hit her. Every word Brandon said, every gesture, every meeting, everything, absolutely everything, had been calculated, rehearsed, planned. Madison stood up, grabbed her phone, and, desperate, began searching for any information. She ran searches for records, names, tried to track his number on apps, investigated any lead that might take her to that man. She hired a detective, gathered everything she remembered, described every detail of his face, voice, habits, the places they frequented together. And when the detective returned days later, he brought in his hand exactly what she most feared to hear. Brandon was an actor. A private investigator hired by none other than Christopher. The game began long before she even imagined. Before the first exchange of glances. Before the first word spoken. Before that cafe where they met. In fact, since the day Christopher noticed she was acting strange, distant, cold, and calculating, he orchestrated everything. He hired the best professional to play the role of the perfect lover. And Madison fell. She fell easily. She fell without realizing. Every smile, every touch, every conversation about love, freedom, starting a new life, was part of a meticulously written script to lead her exactly to that point. Now, sitting there, with trembling hands, staring at that report full of evidence, Madison understood. It wasn't just a divorce. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the complete destruction of the character she had created for herself over the years. And this time, there was no stage, no audience. The show was over. And she was the only one who still didn't realize it. Madison spent days trying to process everything she had discovered. Her head felt like a constant storm. She felt betrayed, deceived, humiliated, exposed, destroyed. And ironically, not by the man she betrayed, but precisely by the one she, until recently, called her husband. The world she believed she had under control had completely collapsed. Every decision, every move, every choice she made in recent months now revealed itself as part of a larger trap, a web she hadn't even noticed being built around her. And worst of all, she herself helped construct it. Without a home, without money, without a car, without credit cards, without anything. The only option left was to return to that place she swore she'd never step foot in again. Her parents' house. Those same simple parents she avoided, whom she pretended to forget when surrounded by high society people. Arriving there was one of the biggest defeats of her life. The woman who once paraded in outrageously expensive clothes and flaunted a life of luxury now carried 2 suitcases and a face marked by shame, humiliation, and the weight of her own choices. The following days were a mixture of silence, tears, and reflections that seemed endless. And the more she thought about it, the more she understood how arrogant she had been. How much she had distanced herself from those who truly cared about her. For years, she believed that money, status, and appearance were everything. That being surrounded by luxury was enough to be happy. And now, she no longer had any of that. All that was left was herself, naked, stripped of any mask, facing her own reality head-on. While Madison tried to rebuild herself, on the other side of the city, Christopher continued with his life. And to the surprise of many, it didn't take long for him to appear with someone else. In the first few days, there were rumors, whispers, malicious comments, as always happens. But it was on a random morning that the bomb exploded completely. A photo began circulating in groups, on social media, in conversations. There he was, smiling, holding hands, at a restaurant, with none other than Samantha. Exactly. Samantha. His former personal assistant. The same woman Madison had despised for years. Whom she treated as invisible. Whom she ignored at meetings, parties, events, and often made a point of humiliating in front of others. In Madison's mind, it seemed impossible. She even thought it was fake, gossip, some kind of cheap provocation. But it wasn't. It was real. And as the days went by, more photos appeared. More records. More proof that yes, Christopher and Samantha were together. And it wasn't a hidden, discreet, or fleeting romance. It was serious. He made a point of appearing publicly with her, introducing her to friends, family, showing the world that he was now with someone who, unlike Madison, had always been by his side, even when no one noticed. And that's when, for the first time, Madison began to see everything differently. She started remembering the times she walked into the office and treated Samantha like she was part of the furniture. The mean jokes, the venomous comments, the looks of superiority. Every time she made a point of showing that Samantha was just an assistant, just another employee, someone irrelevant in that universe where only money, surname, and prestige mattered. What Madison never imagined was that while she was getting lost in her own games, betrayals, lies, and attempts to manipulate her marriage, Samantha was there, observing everything, silently, without needing to say a single word. And when everything collapsed, when the masks fell, the person standing firmly by Christopher's side was exactly the one she had always despised. Life, in a cruel and relentless way, had come full circle. And this time, there was no plan, no lover, no excuse that could save her. All that was left was to face, day after day, her own conscience. The emptiness of someone who had lost everything. The bitter taste of someone who, for years, believed she could toy with other people's feelings without ever being held accountable. And while Christopher moved on with his life, happy, fulfilled, rebuilding everything alongside someone who had always been there, quietly, Madison looked in the mirror and finally understood that at some point along the way, she had lost herself. And now, there was no going back. Because sometimes, life doesn't punish you with pain, or loss, it punishes you by showing you, right in your face, what you could have had, and threw away.
Suspicious of your wife or daughter-in-law? Don't go through what we saw in the video. Check the link in the comments and get the ebook with valuable tips and investigator-approved sites to clear your doubts.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.